the last day of death row inmate Jedidiah Murphy. He shot a 79-year-old woman. On October 10th, 2023, the state of Texas prepared to carry out the execution of a man who had spent more than 2 decades on death row. His name was Jedidiah Isaac Murphy. Unlike many death row cases filled with complex investigations and multiple suspects, Murphy's case was tragically direct, a violent encounter that ended the life of a 79-year-old woman named Birdie Cunningham. The crime took place in the city of Garland, Texas, in the year 2000. Armed with a gun, Murphy approached Cunningham and forced her into her own car. What began as a kidnapping quickly escalated into something far more brutal. The elderly woman was shot, locked in the trunk of her vehicle, and later left in a creek, where she ultimately died. Murphy was arrested just 2 days later after investigators traced purchases made using Cunningham's stolen credit cards. His confession would seal the case and send him to Texas death row. The story of Jedidiah Isaac Murphy is not one filled with complicated conspiracies or multiple suspects. Instead, it is the story of a violent crime committed by a man whose life had already been marked by instability, crime, and repeated encounters with the justice system long before the day that sealed his fate. Murphy was born in Texas in the mid-1970s. His early life was deeply unstable. According to reports presented later during his trial, Murphy's parents abandoned him when he was just 5 years old. After that, he was largely raised by his Jewish grandparents for a period of time before eventually being placed in foster care. From an early age, Murphy's life lacked structure. Growing up across different homes and environments, he struggled to find stability. While some relatives tried to care for him, much of his childhood was spent moving between foster families. Those who later looked back on Murphy's early years described a boy who often felt disconnected from the people around him. Despite those challenges, Murphy did manage to attend school regularly and eventually graduated from high school in a small town east of Dallas, Texas. But by the time he reached adulthood, he had already begun building a long criminal record. Court records show that Murphy's early offenses included robberies, domestic violence incidents, and at least one kidnapping in which the victim was able to escape. These crimes established a pattern of violence that prosecutors would later use to describe him as someone who posed a serious danger to others. In 1994, Murphy was released on parole after serving time for earlier offenses. For a few years after that release, his life remained relatively quiet in public records. But behind the scenes, his behavior continued to spiral. Substance abuse became a serious problem. Murphy began using drugs heavily, including cocaine. By the year 2000, Murphy was 25 years old and living in Texas. On October 4th of that year, his life intersected with a woman named Birdie Cunningham. Cunningham was 79 years old. Very little information about her personal life has been widely reported, something that many observers have noted over the years. Most news stories about the case focused heavily on Murphy, leaving only fragments of information about the elderly woman whose life was taken. What is known is that Cunningham was living in Garland, Texas. That afternoon, Murphy spotted her and decided to target her. Armed with a gun, he approached the elderly woman and forced her into her own car. Under threat, Cunningham was ordered to drive while Murphy remained in control. For approximately 30 minutes, Murphy forced the 79-year-old woman to drive around the area. Eventually, he ordered her to stop the car. What happened next turned the situation from a kidnapping and robbery into something far more disturbing. Murphy forced Cunningham out of the driver's seat and ordered her to climb into the trunk of her own car. As the elderly woman struggled to follow his instructions, Murphy fired a shot at her. The bullet struck Cunningham but did not immediately kill her. Even after shooting her, Murphy continued with his plan. He closed the trunk and began driving the car away from Garland. The trip took him into Van Zandt County, a more rural area located east of Dallas. At some point during that drive, Cunningham was still alive inside the trunk. When Murphy reached a remote area, he removed her from the vehicle. According to investigators, he then placed the injured woman in a nearby creek. Unable to escape and already wounded from the gunshot, Cunningham eventually drowned in the water. After leaving her body there, Murphy drove away in the stolen vehicle. In the hours that followed, he began using Cunningham's credit cards. Records later showed that the cards were used to purchase items such as liquor and cigarettes. These transactions would ultimately become one of the key pieces of evidence used to track Murphy down. Investigators quickly began retracing Cunningham's final known movements. When they examined activity on her credit cards, they found purchases that occurred after her disappearance. Those transactions led detectives directly to Murphy. Within 2 days of the crime, authorities located and arrested him. During questioning, Murphy confessed to the kidnapping and killing of Birdie Cunningham. He also agreed to show investigators where he had left her body. Murphy led them to the creek in Van Zandt County, where Cunningham had been placed in the water. During interviews with police, Murphy claimed that he had been heavily intoxicated on cocaine the day the crime occurred. At one point during the investigation, detectives even drove Murphy around Garland and asked him to identify the exact location where he had abducted Cunningham. Murphy told investigators that he could not remember the specific spot, only that the kidnapping had occurred somewhere within the city. The confession, along with the physical evidence and the credit card trail, gave prosecutors a strong case. Murphy was charged with capital murder. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized the cruelty of the crime. They described how a 79-year-old woman had been forced to drive at gunpoint, shot, locked in the trunk of her own car, and then left to die in a creek. The details painted a disturbing picture of the final moments of Birdie Cunningham's life. The defense focused on Murphy's background. Attorneys argued that his troubled childhood, abandonment by his parents, and years spent in foster care had shaped the man he became. They also highlighted his drug addiction, particularly his heavy cocaine use leading up to the crime. But those arguments did not change the jury's verdict. Murphy was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He was sent to Texas death row, where he would spend the next 2 decades awaiting the outcome of appeals. Life on death row can stretch across decades, and Murphy's case was no exception. Years passed as his legal team filed multiple appeals, attempting to overturn his conviction or reduce his sentence. These efforts eventually ran their course through the state and federal court systems. While on death row, Murphy occasionally communicated with the outside world. In 2007, he wrote a letter that was later published online in an attempt to connect with potential pen pals. In the letter, Murphy introduced himself, spoke about growing up in East Texas, and mentioned that he had a daughter whom he loved deeply. He described himself as someone trying to keep busy and maintain friendships despite the circumstances he faced behind prison walls. Murphy acknowledged in the letter that he had made many mistakes in his life. He wrote about trying to get it right, suggesting that he still hoped to find meaning or connection even while living on death row. The letter offered a glimpse into how Murphy wanted to present himself to the world. Another detail about Murphy that received attention in media coverage was his Jewish background. Although he had been raised for a time by Jewish grandparents, Murphy's childhood instability meant that he had never completed many of the traditional milestones associated with Jewish religious life. One example was the bar mitzvah ceremony, typically held for Jewish boys as they come of age. Murphy had never experienced that moment growing up. But in 2016, while still on death row, Murphy was visited by a rabbi who conducted a belated bar mitzvah ceremony for him inside the prison. For Murphy, it was reportedly a meaningful moment connected to the part of his heritage he had never fully explored earlier in his life. Despite these personal developments during his years on death row, the legal outcome of his case remained unchanged. Murphy's conviction and sentence were upheld. Eventually, the state of Texas scheduled his execution for October 10, 2023. By that time, Murphy was 48 years old. More than 2 decades had passed since the death of Birdie Cunningham. For the victim's family, the scheduled execution represented the final chapter in a case that had begun with a terrifying encounter on a Garland street in the year 2000. Murphy's story, marked by childhood abandonment, years of crime, drug abuse, and ultimately a brutal killing, had come full circle. And as the execution date approached, the focus returned once again to the events of that October afternoon when a 79-year-old woman's life was taken in a crime that would send Jedidiah Isaac Murphy to death row for the rest of his life.